For this chapter, I'm going to deal with the first two parts. We're dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis here. And firstly, we're going to look at some background. Okay, essentially, what happened during the revolution and what happened just before the Cuban Revolution, before 1959. We'll also be looking at US-Cuban tensions, how tensions between Cuba and America escalated during the late 1950s and early 1960s. We're going to look at some things that Castro did after taking power, how the US responded to his actions, and the impact. Okay, so when you think about all the details that we're going to go through, think about the agency of each party, how each party's actions contributed to the eventual Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred in 1962. Okay, so think about the roles of the individual countries, the roles of the superpower, and this is important because, as we know, your chapter 3, Cuban Missile Crisis, could come up for both your SBQ and SEQ. Okay, so a little bit about the background of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're going to look at the time before the revolution in 1959. Okay, so we're going to look at the significance of Cuba to the USA. Why on earth did the USA want to get involved in a place like Cuba? Okay, so firstly, the USA had security interests in Cuba. Okay, the fact that in 1823, basically there was the Monroe Doctrine, which basically stated that the Western powers from Europe, for example, should not interfere further in South America or in the Caribbean islands, Central American zone. If not, they'll be seen as a threat against American interests at the time. And Cuba, being part of the area, was seen as a gateway to the Caribbean islands, and it was very close to the USA. So remember, it was about 150 kilometers away from Florida, which was in the USA. Also, there was this Cuban War of Revolution. Okay, so please do not confuse this with the Cuban Revolution later, but there was a Cuban War of Revolution. This time, it pitted the Cubans against the Spanish. Okay, and essentially the Americans supported the Cubans in trying to kick out the colonial Spanish rulers, and this was in 1898. And because America had a hand in helping the Cubans overthrow the Spanish, the US decided to establish a government that was friendly to American political and economic interests, okay, to ensure that Cuba will not will not be a threat to American security interests over here. Okay, not only was Cuba significant to security interests of America, it also had very important economic implications on America. So if you look over here, essentially after the Cuban War of Revolution in 1898, when America established governments that were friendly to American political and economic interests, the USA then had a lot of companies investing in tobacco and sugar plantations in Cuba. Okay, so tobacco and sugar were the major resources of Cuba, okay, the natural resources of Cuba. So you saw many parcels of land being owned by these American companies to grow things like tobacco and sugar. And not only that, to facilitate transportation within the country itself, the USA built railway and also telephone networks, okay, to basically connect Cuba, places in Cuba together. And because of this, America had a very, very strong economic influence on Cuba. Okay, however, the Cubans were not very happy with this American role, this American dominance in Cuban economic affairs and political affairs as well, actually. And essentially because a lot of Cubans saw the Americans as exploiting Cuban natural resources and also widening the income gap, because the people who really benefited from American intervention in Cuba were the richer Cuban people, Cuban farmers who were who made up the majority of people, didn't really benefit from American policy. So the poor farmers remained poor, whereas the managers who worked under the Americans could really benefit from this process, and therefore the income gap between the poor and the rich widened, and this caused a lot of resentment on the Cuban people's part. So, although America played a part in trying to develop Cuba, this generated a lot of resentment on the part of most Cuban people. Okay, and furthermore, America also intervened politically. Okay, and remember we talked about trying to establish a government friendly to U.S. political and economic interests. So the U.S. had to constantly interfere in Cuban politics to ensure that this remained in place. Okay, and therefore, what America did was to install puppet presidents. So essentially, when you're a puppet, you can be controlled very easily, and that's what America did. It helped to install these puppet presidents whom the Americans could control and who would act in their interests. Okay, so Colonel Batista was one, okay, and he's the most important figure that you need to know because he was the one who came just before Castro took power. So Colonel Batista, he wasn't very popular with the Cuban people. In fact, he was dictatorial. He was corrupted. So he really crushed the opposition towards his rule. And as he became more powerful, he also became more corrupted, and people didn't really trust him. However, the Americans were quite reluctant to stop supporting this corrupted dictator, simply because they preferred him to potential communist rule. Okay, so we're gonna stop here now. So this is basically the setting, okay, that we need to take note of before we look at the actual Cuban Revolution in 1959 itself. So essentially, okay, there was a lot of American interference beforehand. They interfered politically, economically, and they helped establish dictatorship, okay, in the form of Colonel Batista's dictatorship, which wasn't really popular at all. Okay, so this was pre-revolution, so now we're going to look at the revolution itself. Okay, so essentially when a country is under the rule of a very unpopular dictator, a rule of a very unpopular leader, what happens is that a rebellion would be very likely to occur. And in 1956, Fidel Castro and rebels who had been exiled, they returned to Cuba in 1956, and basically they launched a civil war, a rebellion against Colonel Batista's government. And it was successful, okay, because Batista, like I said, wasn't very popular, and people like Castro had support of the peasants in Cuba, okay, which was the bulk of the people. So basically, Castro became very successful, and 3 years after returning, led a successful revolution, and this formed a new Cuban government. So Batista out, Castro in. Okay, so let's look at the American response to this Cuban Revolution in 1959. Okay, a lot of Americans thought that Castro's revolution was actually led by communists, okay, the communist people, but it actually agreed to recognize the government if Castro's government was elected, okay, rightfully elected. And at the time, it's important to note that actually Castro wasn't really affiliated as strongly to the Communist Party, because the Communist Party was only one of Castro's supporters among the many different parties. Okay, so at this time, Castro didn't exactly identify himself yet. Okay, didn't identify himself strongly with the communist vision and the Communist Party. Okay, so this is what happened during the 1959 revolution. Okay, basically America started to see Cuba as a little bit of a threat, okay, simply because they felt that Castro was actually led by the communists. Okay, so now that we've talked about some background, we're going to look at what happened after Castro took over and how America responded to what Castro did. Okay, so Castro, after taking power, decided to do a few things. Okay, and these things would basically anger the Americans and generate a lot of tension between America and Cuba. So firstly, Castro, remember, the Americans, they relied a lot on, as in when they set up companies in Cuba, a lot of them set up sugar plantations, for example, okay, to sell sugar back to America for it. And what Castro did was to start looking for new sugar markets. So basically, to stop relying on this thing called the sugar quota. And this sugar quota was basically something that determined the price and amount of sugar that was bought by the USA. So essentially, because of this sugar quota, okay, the Americans had a lot of say, a lot of control over the sugar trade with Cuba. Okay, so the Cubans were basically at the mercy of the Americans, and because Americans had so much control over the sugar trade in Cuba, Castro wasn't happy at all. So he decided to reduce this reliance on America by looking for new sugar markets, places where he can sell sugar to besides America, to reduce the reliance on America. So Cuba sought new markets, and in Egypt, okay, Che Guevara, basically this guy, very famous, iconic figure. Actually, he was born in Argentina, yeah, and he basically played a part in the revolution, the Cuban Revolution, and helped form Castro's government as well. And what he did was to go to Egypt, and over there, when he was in Egypt, he managed to get in touch with the Soviets, and the Soviet Union agreed to actually buy 500,000 tons of sugar from Cuba, okay, which is really quite a fair share. And the Russians would then buy a further 1 million tons over the next 5 years. Okay, so immediately after Cuba fell under Castro's rule, okay, Castro immediately he sent Che Guevara out, and in doing so managed to contact the Soviet Union and secure a deal with the Soviets to sell them sugar, to rely less on the Americans. Okay, and furthermore, in the 1960 trade exhibition, okay, there was basically an agreement made with the Soviets to barter Cuban sugar for Soviet oil. Okay, so oil was important at the same time because essentially oil helps to develop a country and is needed, okay, as a fundamental natural resource. Okay, so what we see here is an increasing contact between Cuba and the Soviet Union. So what impact did this have? Essentially, the Americans, having found out about this increasing contact with the Soviet Union, seemed to confirm that the new Cuban government was actually pro-communist. Okay, the fact that it was going out, getting in touch with the Soviets, forming economic trade deals with the Soviets, okay, convinced the Americans that Cuba was actually run by pro-communist leaders like Castro himself. Okay, secondly, Castro also implemented this thing called the Land Reform Law. Okay, so reform means basically large changes, so important changes. So this law actually introduced some very fundamental changes to the way land was distributed in Cuba. So large estates were now handed over to the state. Sounds familiar, right? It happened in the Soviet Union, for example. So now these large estates were no longer under private ownership, was now handed over to the state itself. And after these private estates were handed over to the state, they were redistributed to people and were also run as communes. Okay, basically, they were run uh, under the ownership of certain communities. And this was aimed to help solve inequality problems. So, poor farmers who previously worked under rich landowners were now entitled to their own share of land that they could take ownership of. Okay, and Castro actually implemented this land reform law in response to the peasants, because many peasants, like I said, supported Castro during the revolution. So Castro felt that it was an obligation to repay the peasants for their help. After all, they supported him and helped to bring him to victory. So he had to basically fulfill their requests as well. And now foreigners and when you think about foreigners, think about the Americans. They were no longer allowed to own sugar plantations in Cuba, okay, which really dealt an economic blow to the Americans who had over the years owned tobacco and sugar plantations in Cuba. But now they're no longer allowed to use these Cuban plots of land, Cuban plantations for their own economic benefit. So what was the impact of this land reform law? Okay, essentially, it, like I said, affected a lot of Americans because many sugar and tobacco estates were owned by Americans and foreigners. Okay, but mainly by Americans, and a lot of Americans, okay, saw Cuba heading in a communist direction simply because they saw a lot of resemblance between what was happening in Castro's Cuba. Um, to what was happening or what had happened in the Soviet Union. And lastly, I think this took the cake and confirmed suspicions that Cuba was basically moving in a communist direction was Castro's friendship with Khrushchev. Okay, essentially, as we see over here, okay, we see Khrushchev over here, the Russian leader, okay, being very close to Castro over here, who was Cuba's leader. You remember these faces, okay, because when you think about SBQs, for example, you would encounter okay the faces on things like political cartoons. So do not forget these faces over here. Okay, so basically, Castro, having come to power, um, established closer relations with the Soviets in terms of economic partnership. He also forged a close friendship with Khrushchev. And for example, they met in Harlem, in New York, okay, in America, during one of the United Nations sessions, and this was in 1960. Okay, because the meeting of the UN was in New York, so okay, what happened was that Castro decided to stay in Harlem, New York, and Harlem is actually at least during that time was a very poor neighborhood, okay, which was heavily populated by the African American minority community who were basically during that time still very much discriminated against in America. And when Castro decided to stay in Harlem uh, and also meet Khrushchev in Harlem, what the action seemed to do was to be symbolic of opposition towards the discriminatory policies towards African Americans and Cubans. Okay, the fact that Castro didn't stay in a rich neighborhood in a place where it was predominantly white. He decided to kind of form a sense of solidarity with the African Americans in America itself, who were seen as being very much an oppressed population. And Castro also championed African American rights at the UN session. So not only did he stay uh, in an area with a predominantly black community, he also championed their rights at the UN session in 1960. Okay, so essentially, what kind of impact did this friendship with Khrushchev and this overt statement against U.S. Discriminatory policies have? Okay, essentially his stay in Harlem and his UN address offended a lot of Americans. Okay, so Americans during that time wouldn't have liked what Castro was doing, and it made the USA even more suspicious of Castro. And now, okay, the US basically saw Castro as being very close to Khrushchev, and in that way, it was symbolic of the larger relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union itself. So what the Americans saw was Cuba becoming part of the communist bloc, okay, under the influence of the Soviet Union. Okay, so when we think about the Cuban Missile Crisis later on, it's important to know all of these. Okay, what Castro did. Okay, because it basically generated a lot of tensions on the part of US-Cuban relations. Okay, so essentially what Castro did, okay, played a part in generating US-Cuban tensions, okay, which would later translate into the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so how did America respond to Castro's actions? Okay, so firstly, what America did was apply economic pressure on Cuba. Again, the aim of this economic pressure being applied on Cuba was to force Castro to basically reverse whatever he had done, to force him to change his policies. Okay, and basically one of the first things the US did was to order all US oil companies to stop processing Soviet oil. Okay, remember that the Soviet Union was bartering Soviet oil for Cuban sugar at this time. So okay, the fact that they were getting Soviet oil didn't please the Americans at all. And so what Castro did in response to what the US tried to do was to nationalize oil refineries. So all these oil refineries, some of which were under the control of the Americans, were now placed under the control of the Cuban government, the state itself. So a lot of American influenced, American owned oil refineries owned by US oil companies were now confiscated and placed under the control of the Cuban government. And also during the first declaration of Havana, which was basically a speech made by Castro, um, showed Castro arguing that Cuban actions were basically against US economic exploitation. So basically by nationalizing the oil refineries that were owned by US oil companies, the Cubans were basically just defending themselves against US economic exploitation. Okay, so what they did was basically defensible, was reasonable. And the US also decided to reduce the Cuban sugar quota. However, although you have thought that if the US reduced this Cuban sugar quota, okay, this would hit Cuba very badly because suddenly the Americans would buy less sugar from Cuba and buy sugar at a lower price, okay, which would then affect the Cuban economy. However, countries like China and the Soviet Union offered to buy the extra sugar that was no longer being sold to the USA. Okay, and furthermore, Castro nationalized, okay, so again placed under the Cuban government all major US properties in Cuba. So things like sugar mills, okay, where sugar was being processed, and American owned banks, for example, they all placed under Cuban government ownership. Okay, and what kind of impact did this have? Essentially, it's simple because of now the US, in trying to intervene was so unsuccessful, and the fact that its own property and economic influence was being compromised. Okay, the USA saw, okay, what Castro did as an act of war against American economic interests in Cuba. Okay, a very clear act of war, and also that uh, its initiative to try and reduce this Cuban sugar quota was unsuccessful. Okay, because now the excess sugar could be sold to countries like China and the Soviet Union. Okay, so really was a slap in America's face. And finally, America introduced this embargo on American exports to Cuba. So America essentially stopped exporting to Cuba, except for items like food and medicine. Okay, because the justification for this was that the American embargo was basically aimed at the government but not at the Cuban people. So they didn't, if by depriving the Cuban people of food and medicine, essentially they will be punishing the people and not the government. So by doing this, America kept insisting that it was aimed at Castro and his government, and not at the expense of the welfare of the Cuban people. Okay, however, when America introduced this embargo, Soviet Union and its allies stepped in, and basically Eastern European satellite states agreed to buy 4 million tons of sugar. Okay, and therefore this made the embargo ineffective. Okay, simply because Castro can now continue his policies without fear of U.S. sanctions. So although America is trying to put a lot of economic pressure on Cuba, okay, basically with the help of the Soviet Union and its satellite states, okay, this economic embargo, this economic pressure didn't strangle Cuba as much as the Americans would have liked. Okay, so when economic pressure wasn't really working that well, okay, the U.S. also resorted to other means to try and change Cuban policy. And what happened was 1961, okay, this famous Bay of Pigs. I hope all of you remember what this incident was about, but just to refresh your memory if you don't, essentially this Bay of Pigs invasion was launched to overthrow Castro's government. Okay, Bay of Pigs was basically a bay in Cuba itself, okay, where the invaders landed. Okay, and this aim was to overthrow Fidel Castro's government, and essentially the CIA, which is the Central Intelligence Agency, okay, controlled by America, it trained Cuban exiles to land on this Bay of Pigs. So those who have been exiled during the Cuban Revolution in 1959, okay, they went over to the US, they were trained over there, and they returned to Cuba in an attempt to overthrow Castro's government. However, the exiles were not well supported on Cuban ground, and they basically were easily defeated by Castro's forces. And the Americans were humiliated, okay, because of this defeat, because the Americans did support the Cuban exiles by training them, by also providing them with things like weapons, for example. So they felt humiliated, and although the American government tried to move itself away from this invasion to say that it wasn't that responsible. Okay, people actually knew that the Americans had a big part to play in this invasion. And so this gave the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion gave Castro a chance to crack down on his domestic opponents and strengthen the defense of Cuba itself against possible U.S. intervention in the future. So not only did this invasion fail, it basically made Castro even more determined to uh, stop any future invasions on the part of America. Okay, and it also made Castro very sure that okay, America was going to invade in the future. Okay, they wouldn't stop here. They wouldn't have accepted this failure. And after the Bay of Pigs invasion failed, okay, America still looked towards other means to try and remove Castro from the government and to try and install a friendly government of its own. So this Operation Mongoose was launched from November 1961, and it was a secret operation. And okay, two of the things that this operation tried to achieve was to sabotage key Cuban industries, okay, to try and cripple the Cuban economy, and also assassination attempts were launched on key Cuban leaders, and this included Castro himself. Okay, however, as we know, even today, the Cuban government still remains at least in name, under communist rule, and therefore Castro managed to survive many more years after that as leader. So essentially, Operation Mongoose wasn't very successful either. So what kind of impact did Castro's actions and U.S. responses have on the broader scheme of things? Okay, so essentially whatever the US did in response to Castro's actions kind of cemented this formal alliance with the Soviet Union on Cuba's part. So after the Bay of Pigs, like I said, Castro was convinced that the USA would invade sooner or later, and therefore, in order to protect itself, Cuba being such a small country, Cuba needed allies, and there was no one more ideal than the Soviet Union. Okay. Okay, this was especially so when Khrushchev had criticized the Bay of Pigs invasion, and also because of the economic cooperation that had already been established between the Soviet Union and Cuba. So Castro saw the Soviet Union as needing to protect Cuba's interests simply because of the strong economic relationship that they had already formed. And therefore, because of this, to rely on the Soviet Union and to tap on Soviet support, Castro declared himself a Marxist-Leninist, which is basically the ideology that the Soviet Union claimed to have followed. Okay, so to be aligned with the Soviet Union. And so Castro sought formal entry into the communist bloc. And this scared the USA because the Soviet Union now had an ally so close to the United States of America. Just 150 km away, there was a Soviet, in a way, a Soviet satellite state. Okay, but it wasn't in Eastern Europe anymore, but it was a state that was under tremendous influence by the Soviet Union, and that was so close to US shores. Okay, and the result, Cuban-American relationships was now at a very, very, very high point, and now in terms of its tensions, and now became part of the Cold War conflict. So it was no longer an issue between Cuba and America. It became an issue between Cuba, the Soviet Union, plus the Soviet Union against America. So when you have America versus the Soviet Union, you immediately place it within the framework of the Cold War itself. So that's how, from being a relatively contained conflict between America and uh, Cuba, it now became part of the wider Cold War conflict simply because the USSR was involved. So again, when we think about the definition of the Cold War, okay, we realize that it's essentially a tension between the two superpowers, and now we have Cuba falling under the control of the superpower that was the USSR. Okay, so essentially we've talked about the background today and how US and Cuban tensions were generated. Okay, so subsequently we'll deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis itself and the impact of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so all these parts are important because you need to think about the agency of each power, okay, each country which later allowed the Cuban Missile Crisis to take place. Thank you.